Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. And it's episode 6 of Red Matrix. And there's a lot to cover this afternoon, Sean.
As ever, Bern, yes, it's a busy old world out there. So first we're going to look at Ukraine, not least of which there's been the biggest drone attack since the start of the war, largely on Kyiv. And we're going to look at why the changing colour of the drones makes a difference, because Russia's got black drones now. We're going to look at the advent of electronic warfare, how rapidly that's changing technology. We're going to have a quick look at the front line and where actually Russian casualties are mounting to their highest levels ever, even since higher than in Bakhmut. And finally, we're going to look at a tunnel that potentially the Chinese are going to be building for the Russians. A really weird bit of news. Then we're going to quick look at Israel, and the dominating news of Israel, obviously, is the truce that's been happening, the release of hostages. Why is it so difficult to release these hostages? Why is it so difficult to get these extensions to the truce? And are we going to see gradually Hamas run out of hostages, or are we going to see a breakdown and a return to war, and just exploring what next? And finally, we're going to have a little chat about the media. There's been some fascinating friction about, in some quarters of the media, about how they're covering, particularly the Israel conflict. And I think it's been interesting just looking at the difficulties that the media face. So we'll be trying to have a go at that. A lot to get into this week.
Let's get on with it. Russia has just launched its largest ever drone strike. So what was in their mind? What's going on? And was there any strategic advantage to it?
This was interesting because ever since February, when Russia first invaded, they've been using drones and missile strikes the like. But this was, this week, the biggest single drone attack overnight ever since the start of the war. Over 70 of these Shahed 136 drones, the drones that have come in from, brought in from Iran. They're not very fast. They're just over 100 miles an hour. They're not very big. They're not very powerful. But it was pretty evident that a lot of them were thrown at the Ukraine air defense system. So part of the question is, why? Now, one of the reasons probably is that Ukraine's got better and better at shooting these things out of the sky. They are relatively vulnerable to small arms fire, and as long as you learn how to lead turn so that you're firing in front of them, that actually they don't appear that difficult to take down. And Ukraine has regularly claimed they've shot down all of the drones. So what Russian tactics now are probably trying to swamp Ukraine's air defenses, because it's a bit like, remember we talked about the Hamas rockets?
5,000 odd missiles.
Yeah, far more than the Iron Dome system could cope with. If you do try and do the same, so it feels like they've done 70 of these attacks, try to overwhelm. Quantity has a quality all of its own, and therefore some will get through. And that seems to be number one. Another reason might have been that I noted in the press the last couple of weeks, there's been appeals for Ukraine to get more air defense systems from the West. Now, if I was Russia, I'd be going, aha, that means Ukraine is a bit short of air defenses, therefore I'll launch a load of attacks to try to overwhelm them. But also it's worth pointing out, about a year ago, this was when Russia started targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, because we've just had the wet season. It now plummets into the really cold season in Ukraine. And by targeting energy infrastructure, it made life miserable for Ukrainians last year. So it seems like there's probably a bit of deja vu going on there. But it is worth pointing out that last year it didn't seem to affect the morale of the Ukrainians at all. And a bit like London in the Blitz, did Londoners lose the will to fight the Second World War when Germany was bombing London? The answer was no. It stiffened its resolve, and looks almost certain the same was the case here. But it was really notable that this was the biggest single attack since the start of the war.
So maybe, done for terror or done for testing out the defenses, but maybe from that point of view, not so effective. They have changed a few things, haven't they? The technology, I think the colour's been changed as well. What was going on there?
Yeah, there's been reports this week that the new Shahed have come are black, painted black. Now, initially, you go, well, that's just a spray can, maybe makes them a bit more difficult to see at night. But there's actually, if you look closely at some of the reports, they're talking about a special coating potentially being on these drones. And part of that might be to do with stealth, because if you look at our Joint Strike Fighter or any stealth platforms, part of it is the shape of the platform, but part of it is the coverings that go onto them that absorb radars and therefore make it a bit more difficult for radars to see them. So that looks like it's been a sort of next generation of capability brought in. But the other thing that's been really interesting on that front is the use of electronic warfare. I'm old and grey, and we used to have electronic warfare, and you develop countermeasures for what the former Soviet Union had. And then once you got that countermeasure worked over a series of years, they'd work on a countermeasure, and that would take a few years. What we're seeing in Ukraine is that a lot of the drones, whether they're Shahed drones or the lighter drones, they rely on GPS, satellites for positioning. And so the Russians are getting quite effective at jamming those signals. So what is Ukraine doing? Working out how to get around that. The first way they tried to do it was to use terrain mapping, so that if you've got a memory of the terrain between yourself and the target in the computer, it doesn't need to have the satellites. It can just map what's going on underneath it and knows where it is. But what we're seeing is a very rapid development of capability around these drones, how to counter them, how to get past the countering, how to develop the combat to that new. And rather than taking years or even months, our old UOR, Urgent Operation Requirement System, this is almost happening overnight at times. A really fascinating progress in this unseen part of the war. And it'd be really interesting after the war to see how much this flows back into the West, because I think they will have learned a great deal on the fly, but very rapidly. And it's a real innovation on the battlefield.
Yeah, historically, you have 3 or 4 people in a bunker sweating for a couple of months on making an improvement. Now you've got some young kid tapping away on his keyboard, and 2 hours later, big change, big patch has made it.
Well, it's also because when we were doing it before, you had some boffins working away, and they would generate some really clever capability, but then you'd have to develop it, you'd have to productionize it, you'd have to build a production line of things. All of that takes years. This is not what's happening today. It's bodge tape. It's some programmer sat down programming it, sticking some sticky tape on, changing the shape of it, getting a can of spray, and sending it on its way. And it's happening really quickly. Really exciting, but really innovative.
So if we pan back a bit and look at the big picture, last week, the week before, we were talking about the Dnipro River. It's a strategic issue, and we wondered whether Ukraine would be solidifying or strengthening their position there. Has anything really happened from that point of view on the front line? The mud was getting in the way of the war. Does that mean things have, slowed down a bit? What's actually happening out there now?
Well, the short answer is it doesn't appear a great deal for most of the areas of the front line. So Dnipro River, potential breakthrough, not seen any evidence of any progress this last week. East of Zaporizhzhia, the front line, as though Ukraine is trying to make their way through those layered defenses. Again, no great examples of progress, no great surprises. It's actually a mud bath on the battlefields. The one area that's different, though, is to the east. We talked about the battle for Bakhmut and the battle for Avdiivka, which is just to the south of Bakhmut. The Russians have been throwing a lot of soldiers at that, and it's not the right time of year to do this sort of fighting. There's no foliage on the trees, there's less protection. It is highly attritional warfare, and it really is just a key indicator of how important that must be for Russia, because the Ministry of Defense this week released some really interesting figures that said back in March this year, when the battle for Bakhmut was happening, do you remember that? Highly attritional. Russia was using convicts, street fighting.
A lot of casualties.
30,000 casualties. And at the time, they reckon there were about 750 Russian casualties a day. The reports say now, the MOD is reporting this week, that the Russian casualties in the battle for Avdiivka are not 750 a day. They're nearly 1,000 a day for the last 6 weeks. So it's been much more intensive and much more attritional for the Russians. Now, they are closing in on Avdiivka. It's clearly a high price for them. but it's been a brutal last 6 weeks for the Russians, a really, really difficult time for them.
Yeah, and we also considered what that's going to feel like back home for Putin, where the politics meets the war. He's got, local politics in Russia coming up soon. He won't want this disturbing people's equilibrium about how things are going. But, of course, we don't get that sort of news from inland Russia, so we can only hazard a guess as to how it's going down.
I think what's fascinating about that dynamic is that on one side, Russia, from a purely military perspective, needs more soldiers and would probably want to be mobilizing. But as you say, with the Russian presidential elections next year, it might be a foregone conclusion, but what Putin will not want is to do a round of mobilizations and raise the whole prospect of another tranche of Russian people going potentially to their death, because it's been unpopular enough anyway. That would risk some sort of uprising just before the presidential elections. He's not going to want to do that. But in the meantime, therefore, there is a limit to the resources that he has available. The very fact that Russia is not wasting, but consuming such a large quantity of soldiers is a clear indication of just where their priorities lie, particularly around the Donbass and particularly Avdiivka, because it's going to be, I thought Bakhmut was going to be one of the totemic battles of this war, but it looks like Avdiivka is becoming even more attritional for the Russians.
Mm-hmm. So there is one interesting little snippet of news coming from somewhere about this tunnel, and the Chinese are involved. What's that?
It's funny how the little stories that pop out here, but if you look at the Crimea, ever since Russia took that in 2014, they needed a supply line from mainland Russia. So they built the Kerch Road Bridge. It was a Putin special project. It's about 13 or 14 miles long, and it provides a resupply route. That was a regular target for Ukraine in this war. You'll remember there was a truck going across that blew the thing apart, and it's been the subject of several attacks since, and still a limit to how many goods can go across, etc. So Russia has been facing a challenge of how to resupply Crimea, not just Crimea, but the southern part of its offensive. It's been using ships because the port of Sebastopol is a great way of moving, but of course Ukraine has been hammering away at their ships as well, made it really difficult. So the news came out this week that actually Russia has now commissioned a Chinese company to build a tunnel from mainland Russia under the Kerch Straits and back up into Crimea. Now, the distances, they're not quite the same as the Channel Tunnel, but they're not dissimilar. That's a monumental project, and won't be finished anytime soon. But it does demonstrate the clear intent of Russia. This is not a hope to hold Crimea. This is a long-term commitment, financial commitment to building its infrastructure and its pivotal arterial support for Crimea.
Sean, your sort of number one qualifying issue throughout the whole of the Israel-Hamas conflict has been the humanitarian factor, has been the primary thing ultimately we should think about. It's been heart-wrenching to see the casualties and the death on both sides. Now we're down to ones and twos, where a mum or a dad is waiting for their child to be released. It's not the volume, but it's equally heart-wrenching. So we've entered this phase of negotiating about, swap for swap. From films and so on, we think of Checkpoint Charlie, two people walking across a bridge and getting exchanged. All so simple. This is not simple, is it? It's difficult. How are they actually doing it, and why is it so difficult?
Well, picking up on your point about how heart-wrenching it must be, I mean, we've seen over the last few days, lists are being generated last minute. Families don't know when their loved ones are going to be released. There seemed to be an implication at the start that members of one family would stay together. That appears not to have been the case. Just imagine if you were the husband or the aunt or whatever and hoping for your family to return and only half of them is on the list and you're still waiting. The whole process is heart-wrenching, and probably is part of the agenda for both sides potentially in this. But why is it so difficult? Part of it is just practicalities. I mean, Hamas held 238 hostages, if it's to be believed. That's a lot of hostages. They're going to be, will they be all together? Will they be scattered around? And Hamas will not want the release of small numbers of hostages to in any way portray where the rest of them are held. And they will know that Israel will be using satellite technology, anything they can to watch, to see if they can learn where the rest of the hostages are. First of all, Hamas has got to be really careful. They've also got to be careful to know that the hostages, when they are released,
don't know where
they will be debriefed, won't they? And if they are able to, well, it was quite dark, or it was, we were in this, or I saw this, that might all be valuable. So Hamas, first of all, want to dislocate the hostages they're going to release. They'll want to confuse them. They'll be blindfolded. They will be potentially for 24 hours, they'll be run ragged so that they have no idea where they are, where they were held, any idea of their location. Then, of course, you've got the situation of Hamas is not going to hand them over to the Israelis. So the first stage of this is Hamas handing them over to some sort of mediator. In this case, it's the International Committee of the Red Cross. So where's that going to happen? It's not going to happen in Israel. So it's going to happen somewhere in Gaza. It's going to be secretive because Hamas won't want anybody else to know where it is. The Red Cross need to know where it is. It's probably not going to be all of them released together. It possibly could be ones or twos in different locations. So if any one of them is compromised, it doesn't compromise the whole thing. And then Hamas are going to fade away. And the next stage is, how does the Red Cross get these hostages out of Gaza and safely into Israeli hands? Does it come across one of the checkpoints? We've seen some of them come through the checkpoints. Or do they come out through bespoke openings in the border? And then, of course, when they have been released, they'll be desperately keen to go to their families. But, of course, the Israelis absolutely will be wanting to question them, find out everything they know. How were they treated? What were they fed? What was the rhythm of how they were treated? Could they hear anything? Could they see anything? Could they feel the darkness of the tunnels or the dampness of the tunnels? All of that will be invaluable intelligence before they finally get a medical of some form. Then they meet the families, and then they potentially can talk to the media. So it's an incredibly complex challenge, and that's just the tip of the sword. I mean, there's all sorts of other issues about which hostages are going to be released. At the moment, it appears to be they're focusing on the women and children, but we'll see what the future holds.
Yeah, I mean, one question that people have been asking is, why isn't it one person for one person? There's been a bit of sort of crass reporting about this as well. As to why does one Israeli make 3 Palestinians? But just leaving that aside, why is it 1 for 3, or whatever the ratio is? Why isn't it 1 for 1?
Yeah, a lot of this is about how badly you want something. So the simple analogy is, I may have paid £1 for that pen, but if you haven't got a pen and you want it, how much are you prepared to pay for it? And I may extort you for £3 for that pen rather than £1. And if you need it enough, you'll buy it. It's pretty clear in this conflict that Israel, one of its main focuses is to get its hostages back again. And it is prepared to pay quite a high price to get those hostages back. And mindful that there are thousands of Palestinian prisoners being held, it looks likely that they have, the one-on-one doesn't seem to work in this regard.
No, it doesn't work, no.
No, so it's more about, we're prepared to give up a hostage if you release 3 of ours, and Israel's gone, yes. What I think will be interesting is that that works today when you're looking at women and children and being released. But there are several classes of hostages. So there's the menfolk, then there's the international community, and then there's the IDF soldiers themselves. I suspect each of those will require a different negotiation. And by way of historical example, the last time that Israel had one of their IDF incarcerated for 4 years, Hamas managed to secure the release of over 1,000 prisoners for that one soldier.
Yeah.
And interestingly, one of those Palestinians that were released was a guy called Yahya Sinwar, and he's now the head of Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah.
So these were pretty high tariff prisoners that were released.
It's serious stuff.
So I think we're going to see a continuous negotiation around this. So it's not about one Palestinian worth more. It's about the currency, what it's worth to each side to enable a release.
I would deduce from what you said that the smaller the number, actually, the higher the stakes go.
Well, one of the things that's going to be interesting about this whole hostage situation, as we sit here today, there's been an extension to the truce because originally 50 hostages over 4 days. Then they agreed a sort of 2-day extension, 10 hostages a day. And the Israelis have been very clear, we will continue to give you a day's truce for every 10 hostages released. And interestingly, both sides actually, despite all of the frictions, both sides are probably incentivized to make that work. Because Israel wants to get its hostages back and its military operation hasn't secured that. So an extension to the truce, every 10 that come out, reduce the number of hostages. It makes sense. From a Hamas perspective, why would they want to get rid of a currency like hostages? Well, actually, what they want to do is have a long as possible truce. Because the longer it goes on, the more difficult it is for Israel to step forward and start fighting again. And let's do the basic maths now. 236 hostages, 50 first 4 days, so 186 left. If you were to release 10 a day, 18 days, you'd have 6 hostages left. 18 days takes you out to mid-December. And Hamas managed to be very effective with 1 hostage. So 6 is a lot more manageable for Hamas. It's still a very powerful currency. And if we did last 18 days, would Israel actually go back to war for 6 hostages? Or would they look to find another way to negotiate those out? So I think there's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the coming days. Israel will undoubtedly threaten a return to military operations. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a sporadic Hamas is playing hardball, doesn't meet the deadline, Israel goes and starts the fighting again. The mediation from Qatar and Egypt brings it back to... So we might see a stuttering progress, but it's very difficult to see this next phase of fighting for Israel. If they start moving south in Gaza, even the Israelis admit it's going to be highly more casualties, both military and civilian. And is it going to achieve the release of the hostages? Unlikely. Is it going to compound the humanitarian situation? Almost certainly, yes. Will there be increasing pressure on the international community to say stop? So I think there's going to be some really interesting dynamics over the coming days.
As we've said many times, truth is the first casualty of war. We know that in a conflict, both sides, all sides, trade in propaganda, and it's an essential part of winning the information side of the war, the hearts and minds. All sides engaging it, we know that. The wrapper around that is the media, and the media desperately trying to keep up with the guy out there with his smartphone being way ahead of the game, and the urgency to get there, say something dramatic and get there first, sometimes means the media actually get it wrong. So it's, I don't want to feel sorry for them, as I said before, but it's actually been tough for them, hasn't it?
I think it has, and I think there were several examples. We don't want to embarrass anybody in the podcast, but there's several examples and pretty high-profile channels, national channels, that have found themselves getting a bit unstuck with this stuff. And I think part of the issue is the immediacy, and part of the issue is, particularly modern wars, we've normally had embedded journalists with our military. And if you go back through the wars, even Second World War, there was some false reporting in the newspapers because nobody wanted to see people's morale drop, and they didn't really want to tell you what was actually going on. and because it took so long to get the news from the front and people could massage it. So now you have embedded personnel to get a report from what's actually happening, but they only see it through that side, and the journalists are always looking for the other angle. So the second bit of this, apart from the immediacy, is also where the journalists get their news from. And particularly in the Israel-Hamas conflict, it cropped up over the last couple of weeks because the Israeli Defense Force has been escorting national journalists to show them what's going on by taking them into Gaza, but have been very careful to limit what they film and will not let them interview anybody and only showing them certain things. So inevitably the media go, hang on a minute, we're being used here. Mm-hmm. You're only showing us what you want us to show. What are the things that you don't want us to see and why? That's the role of the journalists. So part of the issue has been them going, hang on, we're getting more and more uncomfortable with this, that we're only seeing one perspective. We do need to see a balanced perspective. And of course, that's caused all sorts of furore because people are suggesting, well, why don't you trust the Israelis? They're telling you the truth. Why are you suggesting they're not? It's not about the truth. It's about journalism trying to look at this from lots of perspectives. And I think there's some really good examples of how this has been. The tunnels, you remember the tunnels under the Al-Shifa hospital? The Israelis were clearly convinced that these were being used by Hamas, hiding under hospitals, which is illegal under the Geneva Convention, and therefore Israel wanted to show the world that they were under there. They showcased some Kalashnikovs in some of the hospital rooms. And
all neatly laid out.
And the press went, okay, but there are lots of weapons out here. Right. Then they found a tunnel entrance and they sent a drone in, and there was a tunnel that links up to the main Hamas-controlled network. There. That's the proof they've been using it. But of course, when you actually look a bit more deeply, Israel's responsible for digging some of those tunnels, so they would have known where some of them were anyway. And when you look at the video footage of some of the rooms underground, I'm not an expert, but when you look at it, it looks a bit like a building that's been derelict for a few years. There was no sign of any activity recently, and even the sinks looked, stainless steel sinks that looked like they'd not been used for 20 years. Now, it may well have been that they'd been used by Hamas and were storing weapons and they'd cleared them all out. But it didn't look like it. And therefore, from an Israeli perspective, they were trying to say, there's the evidence, the smoking gun, there's a tunnel, it's in the hospital grounds. But from a media perspective, they're going, okay, we see that. Yes, there are tunnels, they probably have been used by Hamas, but there's not that smoking gun. And that's created, again, more friction with the media. And of course, because the population reading the media are so polarized around this, it's proved very, very difficult. And a good example of the timeliness, you remember the, which hospital? Al Arab Hospital. So back on the 20th of October, where there was an explosion in the car park outside the hospital. Hamas said, Israel has bombed this, 500 people have died. This is an atrocity, it's a war crime. Uproar around the world. 48 hours later, when you actually look at it carefully, you go, the cars weren't blown away, they were set fire and burnt out, but they were still largely where they were parked. That's more of a fuel fire than a bomb exploding. Likewise, if you look at I was a weapons instructor, you look at the impacts of the tiles on the roofs nearby. Any explosion normally blows all of those to pieces. They were still resting on the building. There wasn't a big hole in the ground where normally a bomb would go into. And when you looked at the angles of everything, you went, it's come from the opposite direction. And there was clearly a lot more evidence to suggest that actually this was an errant rocket. You were talking about the Hamas rockets, they're unguided, they're full of fuel, and if they go wrong, they can land almost anywhere. With the benefit of hindsight, almost certainly that was the case. But the irony there was the first people to report it were Hamas, and therefore that's the story that got out. And even when the most likely version of the truth came out, there were so many cynics then that went, no, I believe the first version. I'm not going to believe that second one because the first one suits my narrative. How does the media operate in that space?
It's difficult. And of course, people will believe anything. And as you say, people will believe what they want to believe. I mean, there's a big growing view at the moment that the attack on the 7th of October never happened. And you think, well, how does that happen? So, information sort of spirals out of control. However, my view is that it's not the media's job to fight the war or to influence the war. It's not their job to entertain us or give us, hyperventilation. Their job is to tell us as best they can what's going on. Now, if I was a journalist or an anchor, I'd always want Sean Bell by my side, because it's only going to take you, a minute it took you to say what you've just said about the bomb outside the hospital. Okay, it's going to take you half an hour to analyse the scene. That's not, okay, there's not thousands of you, but there's enough to make sure you don't allow the journalist to hip shoot and come to the wrong conclusion. Very hard to row back from the first one, and damage is done. So I don't give them a free pass. I think they ought to be more careful. If they lose a day for it, and when the smoke's blown away, they realise the building isn't flattened, it's actually still standing, then I think that's the price they have to pay.
The only disagreement I have is that, let's use an example away from the Israel conflict, which has all sorts of other dimensions of polarised view. If we look at the Ukraine conflict, I have had now the best part of 2 years with Sky looking at some of this stuff. And for example, regularly we'd have something like, breaking news, Russia has blown up a school in Ukraine. And there'd be right, Sean, can you talk about that? And they would ask me, and I would go, well, first of all, why would Russia attack a school? I mean, take away the melodrama. Why would they do that? There's no reason why they would do that. Secondly, were there any kids there? Because when you say school, it implies there's kids there. Are there any kids there? Oh, well, there's no kids died. Okay. Thirdly, then, well, what was that school being used for? It's got lots of open areas, halls and stuff like that. Was it being used by the Ukrainian military as a meeting point or a rallying point or, don't know. Because that would make a legitimate target. And finally, again, Russia hasn't been that effective at precision striking, but Ukraine has been very effective at shooting down Russian missiles and drones. And when it shoots them down, they still come to Earth and the explosive is still in them, so they still blow up, but not at their intended targets. And far more debris is falling on Ukraine where it wasn't intended to fall than ever missiles land on their intended target. Far more. If you believe the Ukrainian statistics, over 90% of the stuff is being shot down. So that school might well have been impacted.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, but my deference to the media I'm seeing is asking that question and then actually moderates how it reports it.
Well, so what you're doing, you're keeping your media outlet safe. You're applying your military analysis capability, the years of service in multiple jobs and tours into very difficult situations, using all of that knowledge to first ask all the difficult questions and then apply some analysis to it, so that when the media that you work for comes out with something, it's been tested thoroughly. Sometimes, other journalists don't do that. They don't have a Sean Bell, or they decide, they're kind of in charge of the thing, and that's where mistake. And the mistakes can be.
No, I agree with that, but I would also turn around and say I think one of the issues, returning to the Israel conflict, is that it's really difficult to report in the Israel conflict because it's such a polarized view. There isn't a middle ground. You're either with us or you're against us. And the danger is everybody wants to believe what they want to believe. And it's quite difficult, therefore, to look objectively at a set of circumstances And particularly when you do analysis, because you are looking to a bit of a crystal ball. You are going, here's the facts as we know them. But as you said, grey hairs, a lot of experience. I can put a bit of conjecture about where, my apologies, no hair, about what this entails. But I don't know. But suddenly there's a different version that people go, right, I don't like that version. I'm going to deny it.
Yeah, we're always going to get that.
And that polarizing is much more acute with the Israel conflict than it ever is with the Russian conflict.
Yeah, maybe the rule is, engage brain, be cautious, be a bit suspicious of what you first see, and then do your best.
I agree with that, and I think not for now because we don't have time. But I think you were talking about there's some really interesting other areas of this that we could explore.
Well, fake news, which we ought to get into because we know it's a growing thing in society. Whichever side of the many fences we've got you're on, it's a big issue. Artificial intelligence is coming into play in a really nauseating way. So we ought to spend some time looking at that as well, I think.
And I think that's part of why we're doing this podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is to try to give an informed perspective as best we can from the data we know and from the facts we know, based on a fair bit of experience as well. So,
Right.